They were informed that they would be tortured, violated, and paraded around the streets as war trophies by the Americans, who would kill them slowly. However, the enemy did not raise their rifles when 127 Japanese women, trembling in their drenched clothes, stepped off the transport trucks into the pouring rain at Camp Key, Okinawa, in September 1945. Rather, they brought warm wool blankets that smelled of soup, safety, and mothballs. Soldiers who spoke broken Japanese and motioned for them to drink carried hot miso soup in metal canteens that steamed in the chilly rain. Unable to comprehend what was occurring, the women remained motionless with water running down their faces. They had anticipated dying. They were ready to die. A few had already offered their last prayers. They were given warmth instead. Everything they had been taught about the enemy started to fall apart at that same instant. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel if you are interested in actual stories from World War II that show unexpected humanism in the middle of conflict. Let me now tell you what transpired. Just after sunrise, a torrential tropical downpour began, turning Okinawa's dirt roads into mud rivers. The dismal, low sky covered the island like a damp blanket. Less than a month had passed since the end of the conflict, and it was early September. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been hit by atomic bombs. Emperor Hirohito had issued an order for surrender over the radio in a weak, distant voice. It was the first time many Japanese had ever heard their God Emperor speak, and he informed them that they had lost. The war machine had included the ladies in the trucks. They worked in comfort stations as nurses, clerks, and radio operators. Believing they were serving their country, some had volunteered. Others had no choice but to be conscripted. They were between the ages of 18 and 45. A few of them were mothers. Before the violence engulfed them, some were daughters who had never left their villages. Their flimsy uniforms clung to their skin as they sat cramped in the backs of American military trucks. There was little protection from the rain provided by the canvas covers above. Water collected on the metal floor as it trickled through cracks and fissures. The women remained silent. Their voices had been taken by fear. Everyone had heard the tales of mass killings, of things worse than death, and of what happened to women taken prisoner by the enemy. Kale, a 23-year-old Osaka nurse, held a tiny cloth bag against her chest. A picture of her parents and a letter she had written weeks prior but never sent were inside. She had done her best to waterproof the bag by tying it with twine. She wanted someone to discover it if she passed away tonight, to know that she had existed, and to let her family know that she had been thinking of them in the final moments. The vehicles roared across southern Okinawa's devastated terrain. For 82 days, the island had been a battlefield. Everything was damaged. Structures were merely twisted metal and concrete shells. Palm trees stood like skeletons that had turned black. Where bombs had fallen, the ground was pocked with craters. The fragrance of rain and moist dirt blended with the lingering scent of death. The women remained motionless as the vehicles eventually came to a stop. Their hearts were racing as they anticipated what would happen next. Outside, they could hear loud, deep American voices yelling commands in a harsh, alien language. Puddles splattered boots. The canvas flap at the back of the truck was pushed back by someone. The smell was the first thing that struck them. It was coffee, not the smell of death they had anticipated. Coffee is bitter and strong. It blended with the rain as it floated from somewhere close. Then smoke from cigarettes. American smokes are somehow sweeter than Japanese cigarettes. At the rear of the truck, a soldier emerged. He was young, about 25, with freckles all over his nose and red hair. Rainwater shimmered on the poncho he was wearing. He didn't aim a firearm at them. He extended his hand. The women got off the truck one by one. The lengthy trip had made their legs stiff. In the muck, some staggered. The soldier steadied an elderly woman by grabbing her by the elbow. His contact made her wince, but she stayed put. He had a firm but not harsh grasp. They were battered by the rain. They were completely saturated in a matter of seconds. Their systems were stunned by the cold. Some started shivering violently. They chattered their teeth. A barely 18-year-old girl began to sob quietly, her tears blending with the rain on her face. With water collecting around their feet, they formed a line in the mud. The American camp was arranged in tidy rows, with generator trucks buzzing with electricity, wooden structures erected on stilts, and tents with peaked roofs. Everything was functioning, well-organized, and in order. It didn't resemble the mayhem they had envisioned. There were more soldiers. They did not act aggressively, but they did move with purpose. One was using a clipboard to compare names with a list. Another pointed the women in the direction of a big tent. With his gun draped over his shoulder and aimed at the ground, a third man stood watch. He didn't appear furious or harsh, just bored. They were surrounded by the sounds of the camp. Rain beating on canvas, generators whirring. There was fast-paced, jazzy American music on the radio. Men chuckled. Someone drove nails into the wood. It was the sound of routine and normalcy. It didn't sound like a place where people were put to death. Kao's eyes were wide as he saw everything. Her entire body trembled, partially from fright and partially from the cold. She had received nursing training, saw horrific traumas, and cradled dying men in her arms. However, nothing had prepared her for this peculiar, bewildering mercy. An elderly woman named Haruko was standing next to her, and she was whispering in Japanese so softly that Kao could not hear her over the rain. Despite their simplicity, the words conveyed the weight of their mutual uncertainty. "They're not firing at us." "No," Kao said in a whisper. "They're not." Other women in their immediate vicinity were realizing the same thing. The anxiety did not go away, but it changed into something else. Bewilderment, incredulity, and an odd, hesitant hope that perhaps, just possibly, they would make it through this day. An American policeman came over. He was perhaps 40 years older than the rest, and his temples were gray. He spoke cautiously and slowly in Japanese. The words were understandable, despite his awful accent. "You are POS. International law will govern how you are treated. You won't suffer any harm." Some of the women bowed instinctively, a childhood reflex. The motion appeared to unnerve the officer. He indicated that it wasn't essential by waving his hand. Then he turned and yelled something in English. Soldiers started to move, bringing big parcels wrapped in canvas in the direction of the women. The women discovered what they were blankets when they opened them. Numerous thick brown and olive green wool blankets. Hold on. Tightly wound in their chests, the fear persisted. Every instinct cried out that this could not be true, that the cruelty would start at any moment, and that the blankets were a test or a ruse. However, the soldiers just gave them to each woman. Like dads wrapping their daughters on a chilly night, several of the soldiers even covered the women's shoulders with the blankets. Kao's shoulders began to feel the blanket's weight. It was heated and heavy. It was dry, yet it had an odd fragrance, like chemicals being stored. The shivering stopped for the first time in hours as she drew it close about herself. The soup then arrived. Still covered by their blankets, the women were escorted to a huge tent. It was dry beneath the canvas, but the rain had not ceased. It was warm inside, but the sound of rain pounding the tent roof was so loud that it was difficult to converse. The corners of portable heaters gleamed orange. Rows of tables had been arranged. An American soldier with a clipboard and a translator sat at each table. After being split up into groups, the women were instructed to wait their turn. They watched everything with anxious eyes as they stood in groups, still holding onto their blankets. Kao moved slowly toward the table when it was her time. Behind it stood a young soldier with kind eyes and brown hair. She was softly addressed by the translator, a Japanese-American man dressed in an American uniform. "What is your name?" "Tanakao?" Her voice was hardly audible above a whisper as she responded. "How old are you?" 23. Occupation prior to the conflict? A nurse. I worked as a nurse. The soldier took note of this after hearing it from the translator. Then he murmured something in English while glancing up at her. The interpreter turned to face Ko. He wants to know if you need medical attention or if you are hurt. She was taken aback by the question. She gave a head shake. No, I'm all right. The soldier gave a nod. He gave her a card that had been stamped. This was her identify. The translator clarified. She had to always have money with her because she would need cash for accommodation and meals. The soldier shouted something else as Ko turned to go. The interpreter grinned. Welcome to Camp Key, he says. Here, you'll be secure. Unsure of what to do, Ko bowed once again and turned to leave. She gripped the identity card with trembling hands. Her name was printed in both English and Japanese on it. It was genuine and official. Despite being incarcerated, she was still alive. The women were taken to a different tent after processing. This one was used as a mess hall. The room was filled with long tables and benches. American cooks stood behind sizzling pots at the far end. The women were halted in their tracks by the aroma of miso soup. Authentic miso soup. Kao's eyes grew wide. It had been months since the worst of the conflict, and she had not smelled miso. She had no idea where the Americans had gotten miso. But there it was, the distinct fermented salty smell of home. A soldier motioned for them to line up. They obeyed, advancing cautiously but slowly. A cook ladled soup into a metal cup and gave each woman a slice of fresh, soft white bread as she approached the front. Ko looked down at her cup after receiving it. The soup was nearly too hot. From the surface, steam emerged. In the broth, she could see seaweed and tofu floating. It resembled the soup her mom used to prepare. She took a seat at one of the long tables. The other women followed suit. Nobody moved for a long time. They all did nothing but gaze at the dish in front of them. The elder woman who had stood next to Ko in the rain, Haruko, raised her cup to her lips. She took a tiny sip. She shut her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek. That little gesture broke her. Women started to drink around the table. Some took their time, enjoying every drop, while others drank rapidly and frantically, as though they were worried the soup might be taken away. The cold that had taken root in their bones was driven out by the warmth that permeated their bodies. Ko took careful, little swallows. She was entranced by the taste. She wasn't in an enemy prison camp for a split second. In her mother's kitchen, she felt safe and loved. Even though the illusion was fleeting, it was sufficient to shatter something within of her. She could feel the tears coming, hot and uncontrollable. American soldiers stood around the tent. Some appeared uneasy, not knowing how to handle all many sobbing women. Others turned their heads away, allowing them to grieve alone. Without being asked, an elderly soldier with a gray mustache came over with a pot and refilled cups. His face was sorrowful but friendly as he filled cup after cup as he went down the line. A young woman asked Ko in a whisper, "Why are they doing this? Why are they being kind?" Ko was at a loss for words. She took another sip of soup and shook her head. The women were served paper-wrapped rice balls after the soup. It was simple food, but it was more than they had eaten in days. Some of the women preserved their rice balls by putting them in fabric bags or pockets, a practice that dates back to periods of famine. Others ate right away, their bodies aching for calories. After the lunch was over, an officer got up and talked via the interpreter. He clarified that they will be shown to their lodgings and given clean clothes. In the evening, there would be more food. They were supposed to relax. They would start working on projects tomorrow, although they wouldn't be doing much. Nobody would be mistreated. In startled stillness, the women listened. Their beliefs and all the information they had been given about the Americans were falling apart. Monsters were what they had anticipated. They had discovered folks who provided them with soup. The barracks were straightforward timber buildings that were elevated above the muck on stilts. About 30 women were housed in rows of bunk beds in each structure. The mattresses and linens were actual, white starch sheets, and the beds were tiny but tidy. Kao was given a top bunk by a window. She climbed up and perched on the edge, testing the mattress. It was silky, yet thin. It seemed luxurious after months of sleeping on cramped floors or hard ground. Every woman received a little wooden box to keep personal items in. Kao put her identity card and canvas bag inside. She folded the blanket carefully and put it at the foot of her bed to protect it from the rain. She didn't care that it still smelled like rain and mothballs. Now it was hers, evidence that this was genuine. As dusk fell, the rain eventually stopped. Stars emerged as the sky cleared. For the first time in days, the night was clear. Gathered by the windows, the women gazed up at the sky. In the distance, they could hear American soldiers singing. It was an odd, alien sound, but not disagreeable. Haruko arrived and took a seat on the bunk beneath Kao. She was a 43-year-old Nagasaki schoolteacher with gray hair. She had been forced to work in a communications office for the military. She had been on Okinawa when the bombs went off. Since then, she has not heard from her relatives. "Do you think they will really let us live?" Silently, Haruko inquired. Kei glanced down at her. "I think they already have," she remarked. "We would be dead if they intended to murder us. However, why? Why give us food? Why do you give us blankets?" Kei gave a headshake. "I'm not sure. Perhaps they abide by their regulations. Perhaps they simply differ from what we were informed." For a while, Haruko remained silent. "My daughter is 16, she continued. "She's starving, if she's still alive. The entire nation is going hungry. And here we are, incarcerated, consuming miso soup and rice." Her voice was thick with guilt. Kao sensed it as well. She remembered her younger brother who had been drafted and sent to fight in China, as well as her parents in Osaka. She had no idea if any of them were still alive. And here she was in an enemy camp, fed and safe. Sleep came slowly that night. Other for the occasional sob and the sound of breathing, the barracks were silent. Some women sobbed till they fell asleep. Some lay awake, attempting to make sense of the day while gazing at the ceiling. Kao closed her eyes and drew her blanket up to her chin. She relived the scene in her head where the soldier had given her the soup cup. His face had been friendly and youthful. He had given her a faint, clumsy, but sincere smile. For the first time since the start of the war, she felt something she had nearly forgotten, though she did not comprehend it. She felt secure. At Camp Key, the days became routine. A bell rung at 6 every morning. The ladies got up, cleaned themselves at public sinks using real soap and running water, and put on the basic work clothes they had been given: gray cotton shirts and pants, which were better than the tattered uniforms they had arrived in. Breakfast was served at 7. Rice porridge, occasionally with pickled vegetables. Tea, which the women preferred. Coffee, which they had never tried before and found too bitter. And bread, which was considered a luxury. Work assignments were given out after breakfast. Based on their abilities, the women were split up into groups. Kao and other experienced nurses were sent to work in the camp medical tent. Some were employed in the supply depot, the mess hall, or the laundry. Vegetables were grown in several well-kept gardens. Unlike the cruel labor they had heard about in other camps, the work was not difficult. The Americans appeared to strictly adhere to their guidelines, which included 8 hours of work per day, relaxation periods, and no harshness or beatings. Kei collaborated with Lieutenant Harris, an American medic. He was a tall, slender man from Iowa, which Kao discovered was located far from the coast in the middle of the United States. She didn't speak any English, and he didn't speak much Japanese, but they were able to communicate through smiles and gestures. He taught her the English words bandage, medicine, and patient. Her tongue fumbled with the strange sounds as she carefully repeated them. When she mispronounced words, he chuckled, but not cruelly. It was a teacher's chuckle, not a tormentor's. She taught him a few Japanese words in exchange, such as sumimasen, which means excuse me, and arigato, which means thank you. She had to shield her mouth to conceal her smile as he ruined the pronunciation. At midday, the women were brought lunch, which consisted of rice, vegetables, and occasionally fish or tinned meat, more food than they had seen in years. Many were first unable to complete their meals. After months of almost famine, their stomachs had shrunk, but their bodies gradually adapted. To regain their strength, they started eating more. The women had leisure time after work. Some penned letters, but they were unsure if they would ever make it to Japan. Others got together in small groups to discuss their families, the past, and what would happen after the war ended and they were taken home. There were occasionally movies in the nights, American pictures projected onto a wide sheet suspended between two poles. The women watched stories in a language they were unable to understand while sitting on benches. However, the pictures of cowboys and dancers, huge buildings in cities, and a world so apart from their own were sufficient. The inconsistencies tore at them, even as they grew accustomed to the routine. Smuggled through Red Cross channels, letters from home started to arrive. They brought terrible news. A neighbor sent a note to Haruko. Although she lived in the wreckage of their home, her daughter was still alive. She was eating grass and tree bark. There was no work, no food, and no hope. "We are starving, so please send anything you can," the letter concluded. With a broken voice, Haruko read the letter to Keo. She declined to have dinner that evening. There were no words, so Keo sat with her without saying anything. In the latter days of combat, Yuki, a young mother, found out that her husband had perished. Her 2 kids were in an orphanage. She didn't eat or talk for 3 days as she sobbed. The Americans took note. Some were unsure on how to react. They were combat-trained soldiers, not comfort-trained ones. However, others made an effort. Yuki refused to eat the extra food that Lieutenant Harris brought her. One evening, she sat with Thompson, another soldier with children of his own, and he showed her photos of his children. Although he was unable to communicate in her language, his generosity was beyond words. The women put on weight in the interim. Their expressions became more complete. Their once gray, sallow skin seemed to gleam with health. Once brittle and dull, their hair became thick and glossy. The irony was intolerable. They flourished in captivity. Their family was starving at home. Keo stood in front of a tiny mirror in the bathroom one evening. She hardly knew who she was. Her hollow cheeks had disappeared. She had brilliant eyes. She appeared well, almost joyful. The flood of remorse swept over her. She closed her eyes and held onto the sink's edge. When her family was in pain, how could she look like this? When they weren't eating well, what right did she have? Small moments of connection persisted despite the guilt. These times contradicted what the women had been taught about their enemy. Keo was at the medical tent one afternoon when a soldier was brought in. While fixing a fence, he suffered a severe cut to his hand. Lieutenant Harris motioned for Keo to assist since he was preoccupied with another patient. Despite her anxiety, her hands remained steady as she treated the wound. The young soldier, who had blue eyes and blonde hair, winced but did not retreat. He spoke in English while she applied the bandage. His tone was appreciative, but she did not comprehend. He took a chocolate bar out of his pocket when she was done. He smiled shyly and presented it to her. After a moment of hesitation, she bowed slightly and accepted it. With a nod, he departed. She later gave Haruko some of the chocolate. They each took a tiny square and let it to melt on their tongues. It was nearly too sweet. It was unlike anything they had eaten in years. It rained again the following day, although it was cold and persistent rather than as heavy as the first day. In an attempt to stay warm, the women were gathering in the barracks. A soldier with a box emerged at the entrance. There were old American periodicals inside, with articles about movie stars, ads for cars and refrigerators, and images of women in lovely clothes. Fascinated, the women pored over them. They could not fathom the world of abundance shown in the pictures. Haruko gestured to an image of a modern, immaculate kitchen with a refrigerator that was taller than a person. She questioned, "Is this real? Do people really live like this?" Kao was unaware. It appeared unattainable, like a fantasy. When questioned, however, the soldier who had brought the magazines nodded as though to respond, "Yes, this is normal." During a work shift at the mess hall, the most unexpected moment might have occurred. A number of the women had been learning how to make American-style pancakes from one of the American cooks, a burly man named Murphy. He motioned for them to give it a shot on this lazy afternoon. After mixing the batter, Kao and two other people poured it onto the heated griddle. It smelled wonderful, buttery, and delicious. When the pancakes were cooked, Murphy distributed forks and sprinkled them with syrup from a tin can. The women's eyes grew big when they bit into the pancakes. Soft and delicious, it was completely unlike anything they had ever eaten. It was like eating a cloud. Murphy chuckled, his entire body trembling with a deep belly laugh. Even though they couldn't comprehend what he was saying in English, they could tell that he was pleased to see them enjoying something he had created. Kao became terrified when she understood that these folks weren't monsters. They were merely dudes. Common men who wished the war would end and missed their homes. Men with good humor and compassion. The males were similar to those she had met in Japan. What did it say about everything if they were merely men? Kao lay awake and struggled with her thoughts late at night, when the barracks were quiet and most of the ladies were asleep. Her upbringing had taught her that the emperor was divine, that Japan was destined to dominate Asia, and that Americans were demonic beings who detested and sought to exterminate the Japanese. However, the Americans at Camp Key did not behave in a demonic manner. They behaved like the farmers, doctors, and teachers she had known her entire life. They put up a lot of effort. They bemoaned the heat. They exchanged family photos with one another. They simply wanted the conflict to end because they were worn out and homesick. Kao discovered a piece of paper and a pencil one evening. She started writing, but it wasn't a letter. Rather, it was a journal of her inner turmoil. She wrote about those amazing pancakes from Murphy, how Lieutenant Harris was teaching her English, the soldier who gave her chocolate, and the soup on her first day. She felt guilty for eating 3 meals a day while her parents might be starving. Nothing made sense anymore. They threatened us with torture, yet they fed us daily and gave us medicine when we were sick. We are not defeated by them. We are not starved by them. Compared to our own troops, they treat us better. Her hand shook as she hesitated. Such statements were genuine, yet writing them felt like treachery. She had witnessed the harsh and disdainful treatment of lesser levels by Japanese commanders throughout the war. She had witnessed soldiers beaten for minor infractions. She had witnessed women work till they were exhausted while eating very little. Japan did not feed its own citizens as well as the Americans did its prisoners. She was shaken by the realization. Fearing that someone could discover it and consider her a traitor, she folded the paper and concealed it beneath her mattress. She wasn't the only one who was confused. The women conversed among themselves, always cautiously and silently. Some people held on to their traditional beliefs. They maintained that the Americans were just abiding by their norms at the moment and would soon show who they really were. They waited for the brutality to start with suspicion and caution. Others started to doubt all they had been taught, particularly the younger women. They posed risky queries, such as, if we were misled about the Americans, what else were we misled about? Was the emperor really divine if he predicted our victory and we didn't? Late at night, when no one could hear, these inquiries were murmured. It would be unimaginable to discuss such things in public. But the women let themselves be doubtful in the dark, when they could only hear each other. The teacher, Haruko, had the hardest time. She had instilled reverence for the emperor in her pupils. She had led them in hymns honoring the armed forces. Every word had felt true to her, but now she was lost in doubt as she sat in an American camp, munching on American food and wearing American clothes. She shared with Kao a conversation she had overheard between two American soldiers one evening. They were chatting about going home, their families, and what they wanted to do after the war. One dreamed of opening a store, while the other wanted to go back to school. Silently, Haruko remarked, "They sounded like my husband. He intended to operate a bookstore before the war. He was an avid reader." With tears in her eyes, she halted. "They murdered him. These men, or men similar to them. Nevertheless, they sound exactly like him when I listen to them speak." Kao was at a loss for words. It was impossible to reconcile the conflicts. Sachiko, a radio operator, was another woman who lost her temper. She didn't want to ask. She didn't want to question. She wanted things to be straightforward once more, to recognize the adversary and harbor pure hatred for them. "They are trying to break us," she was adamant. "This generosity is a weapon. They wish for us to lose our identity." However, the words seemed empty even as she spoke them. If kindness was a weapon, it was the most peculiar one any of them had ever come across. 3 months into their incarceration, the real breaking point occurred. A cargo of supplies, including medication, arrived at the camp. Supplements and vitamins were among the items. Every prisoner would get a medical examination, according to Captain Rodriguez, the camp doctor, a serious guy. Nervous, the women lined up. Exams for medical conditions could indicate anything. He informed her that she was malnourished, but getting better through a translator. Undernourished. She was struck by the word. She had been steadily starved due to malnutrition. She was now receiving medication to restore her health while incarcerated by the enemy. Sitting outside the barracks with Haruko that night, Kao finally spoke what had been on her mind for weeks. "They care if we live or die," she muttered. "Not because they have to, but because they believe it is right." For a while, Haruko remained silent. She then gave a nod. "I think you were right," she remarked. "And I think that means everything we were told was a lie." The words lingered between them. They could not be retracted once they were said. To acknowledge that their own government had deceived them would be to acknowledge that all of the pain and death had been in vain. It was nearly unbearable. However, it was also the reality. The women started to accept it slowly and painfully. The Americans were not flawless. They each had preconceived notions. Some continued to regard the Japanese ladies with disdain or distrust. Some of the guards were aloof and icy. There were times when cultural misunderstandings resulted in perplexity or wounded sentiments. However, they were intended to be protected by the system itself. The regulations were obeyed. The Geneva Convention was respected. Even in their own nation, the women had never been treated with the basic decency the prisoners received. And everything was altered by that insight. A chilly December morning marked the moment of total metamorphosis. There was word that the Tokyo war crimes trials had started. Leaders of the Japanese military were being held responsible for the crimes they had committed throughout the conflict. One of the Japanese-American soldiers translated the transmission, which the women gathered around a radio to hear. Some women insisted it was propaganda and refused to believe it. Others, however, knew it was genuine, since they had witnessed events during the conflict and heard tales and whispers. Kao recalled a day she had spent working as a nurse in a military hospital early in the conflict. She had witnessed the incarceration of Chinese people. They had been mistreated like animals, beaten and hungry. When she had questioned it, she had been told that they weren't truly human. that they were the enemy, and that they weren't worthy of mercy. At the time, she had accepted it, or at least hadn't questioned it. Now, however, she understood. Sitting in an American camp where she, the enemy, was receiving blankets, soup, and medication. She had been a part of the system that permitted the horrible crimes committed by the Japanese military. The guilt was too much to bear. She was unable to eat that evening. Trying to take it all in, she sat on her bunk and stared at nothing. Haruko got up and sat next to her, simply placing a hand on Keio's shoulder without saying anything. For a long period, they sat in that position. Keio finally said something. "We were the bad ones," she said. "Not them." "U.S." Haruko gave a slow nod. "I think perhaps there are no good ones and bad ones," she stated. "There are just individuals. People can also be friendly or harsh. Japan was brutal. America is showing compassion. However, both are merely composed of human beings." It was a straightforward yet profound fact. Something inside Keio broke and reformed at that precise instant. She had always had a straightforward view of the world. Japan was good. The enemy was terrible. There was hierarchy and order, and everyone obeyed without question. However, the world was not easy. Furthermore, the enemy was not what she had been taught. The propaganda, the lies, and the system that educated young women to sacrifice their lives for a mere male ruler had been the true enemy. She glanced around the barracks at the other ladies, all of whom were alive because the Americans had opted for mercy over retaliation. Some were sleeping, some were reading, and some were penning letters to family they might never see again. Keio made a choice at that very time. If she went back to Japan, she would be honest. She would share with others what she had witnessed, that the Americans were not demonic, that goodwill could exist even between adversaries, and that the true lesson of the conflict was not who prevailed or failed, but rather what we should do when we have authority over others. It was a risky choice. She would say it even though many people in Japan would not want to hear it. Because the women at Camp Key had received a gift, the ability to recognize the truth, in addition to the gift of survival. Furthermore, once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen.